These teachings of Christ about salt and light on the ears of the hearers thousands of years ago is quite different than what we hear. You and I live in a world of convenience where a light switch is really what we expect. It's a matter of convenience, and candles or lights that burn really are matters of comfort for us. We like the scented candles, midnight summer and cucumber vermilion or whatever it is. All these fancy things. But light and salt in Jesus' time were essential. There's actually a Latin saying that said, "Nil utulius solo et sale." Nothing more useful than sun and salt. Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt because of its important qualities. It was the only real way to preserve anything. This is historically why we say when something or someone doesn't do their job, they're not worth their salt. In fact, the root word for salary comes from the word salt. Salt was important because it could preserve against decay, and most all of the salt that would be known in Jerusalem around Galilee would come from the Dead Sea. There are only two bodies of water with a greater salinity on the face of the earth than the Dead Sea. And with that salinity and the salt and the evaporation process, it would not be necessarily totally pure, it would have some impurities moved in and through it. We're not exactly sure of this imagery of salt losing its saltiness and being thrown out, but we all understand that salt can be diluted to where it has a minimal impact whatsoever. We also know that sometimes too much salt is not a good thing. We have a couple of cardiologists in the church, and they will probably appreciate this non-specific advertisement for you to watch your hypertension and your sodium intake. You look at the label if that's ever a problem for you. You find how much sodium there is in something. You watch your diet carefully. But the problem for most of us as followers of Christ today is that we have high sodium diets and low sodium faith, when we should have low sodium diets and high sodium faith. Why is that? Well, maybe it's because what the world sees in us. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers." Nothing against Boxwell, but I think that's hilarious. How do we look to the world? And you know the importance of something's rather bland. The first thing you tend to look for is the salt shaker, unless you're experiencing hypertension, and then you know that thing called Mrs. Dash. I think the problem with our world is we have too much Mrs. Dash kind of faith. I'm not talking about your physical diet, I'm talking about your faith diet. You see, so often we want to grab a little bit of this and a little bit of that from the world's ideas. A little bit of low commitment, a whole lot of comfort, some blessing, some financial comfort, and we just sort of want to sprinkle on this herb mixture of emptiness when we should be focusing on the primary ingredient of our faith, which is the salt and faith that comes from the one who's spoken of in scriptures, who opened blind eyes, who touched lame arms, who saw those others did not. Jesus the Christ. So this idea of being the salt of the earth, it would be entirely new teaching and new idea to those who heard, but it's absolutely grounded in their everyday experience. The fish that would come from the Sea of Galilee to be taken throughout the countryside and down to Jerusalem, they would be preserved the salt from the sea of the Dead Sea. And with all of the trace minerals that come, there is a chemistry faith lesson about the integral part that salt plays in the trace minerals that are carried and what we need. I went on to World Market on the web. Just out of curiosity, I Googled when I got to World Market just salt. I found like 123 different kinds of salt. You can get Mediterranean salt, you can get smoked salt, you can get this salt, you can get that salt, salt infused with this. You can get granulated salt, you can get salt from here, you can get different kinds of salt grinders. And so while there are particular nuances to that salt, it carries the same basic characteristic. And being a Methodist preacher, I'm sure you would expect me to talk about the nature which salt gives some depth of flavor to food. I once had a cake baked for me in a small town. The person mistakenly put in, instead of sugar, put in salt. It was distinctively different. And that's a very delicate conversation as a new pastor in a small town. When that person says to you the next Sunday, "Did you like my cake?" "Well, I've got some downstairs you might taste." Salt, you know when it's present and you know it's not, and the world around us knows the same. This very basic understanding that Christ gives us. And he couples that idea with light. But the different part of the imagery of light is that Jesus himself said in John, "I am the light of the world." And so this beautiful imagery that you and I are salt and light because of what God does in and through us. And the imagery of light is easy for us to grasp. Lights are guides. There's lighthouses. And in most cities other than Amarillo, there are traffic warning lights that people obey. There are street lights. There are night lights. There are all kinds of lights that guide our life. But none is more important than the light of Christ. And so as we think about this world in which we live, in which shadows and darkness and accusation abound, which people tend to take positions only to demean and beat down others, you and I are clearly called to be salt and light in this world to make a difference for others. And I want to wrap this imagery and insert it into Jesus' prayer for you and me found in John chapter 17. In John chapter 17, around verse 15, and just before, Jesus says, "Lord, I don't pray that you will take them out of the world." And see, one of the things that's important is we often think that our faith should insulate us from the experiences of pain and hurt in this world. But there's nothing in Scripture that says that if we come to faith in God, we will be insulated from heartbreak or hurt. Our coming to faith is what gives us strength and endurance to move through those places of heartbreak and hurt. And Jesus says, "My prayer is not that you would take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They're not of this world, even as I'm not of this world. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is the truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world." So you and I are not only reflecting the light of Christ in us, we're not only salt in the world, we are sent into the world for a purpose, and that is to reflect the love of Christ in this world. And the powerful part of this prayer in John 17 is that verses prior to this is that Jesus is speaking of the disciples, and he specifically says, "I don't only pray for these, my Father, but for all who follow and would believe." Think about that. Centuries ago, Christ praying for you and your faithfulness in the world, that you would muster the courage and have the willingness to reflect what God's salt and light is in this world. You, me. Not in sort of a Mrs. Dash kind of way and low-level commitment, but in a hearty way, that we would be sanctified. Now that gets some Methodists nervous when you talk about sanctification, but historically that's our domain as Methodist. Wesley spoke a lot of sanctification and its understanding. Wesley spoke specifically in three ways about grace: the kind of justifying grace of what Christ has done on our behalf on the cross; the kind of prevenient grace, which is God's grace that's always around us even though we're not aware of it; the kind of grace that's in the voices of people and situations, things that God is doing even when you're not aware of it. And then a sanctifying grace, the kind of grace that God's Spirit moves in and through us so that what Christ did on our behalf on the cross, Christ will do through us in sanctifying grace. And in Greek, this word of sanctification, it literally means simply to be set apart. I can remember that my dad would often say when my mother would bake a cake that she was to sanctify a piece of cake for him, to set it apart. This was especially true in my teenage years. And it was his way of telling my mother, "You make sure the Hoover with legs doesn't eat it all." We're set apart for a purpose, not for our comfort, not for us feeling better about doing less. We're set aside for the purpose of God's love to find us, to have the incredible privilege to come and kneel today, to receive a portion of bread, to encounter Christ in the Eucharist, to know that there's a God who walks with us, not because we're called to be out of the world, but to be a part of the world, but not consumed by it. Those are the exact words that Paul spoke later in the book of Romans. So my friends, we come this day. We come because you and I are called to be the salt of the earth. We are called to be the light of the world. We are called to be God's purpose in this world. I pray that as you leave this day, you would be like the children. And that as you leave, you would look at all those places where there are lights that give direction to people. And every time you see one, answer this question for yourself. Do you need to lighten up a little bit and let the light of Christ guide your life?